I'm hearing like bubbling water. Is someone like taking a bath in the background, or is that
No,
just radiator?
it's the turtle tank. There's a filter.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, let's just record 10 seconds of silence so I can then use that to filter it out. Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. I'm joined by one of my favorite regular guests, Jessica Plummer. We're talking about comic books, we're talking about heroes, and the topic of today is one that, like a lot of times happens, we've gone on a little bit of a journey with. Because about a month ago, one of my favorite creators put out a TikTok where he basically said, look, I know that everyone thinks that Cyclops from X-Men is a cop, but here's all the reasons why he's not a cop. And I thought that was interesting because I've heard many people say, oh yeah, of course, people think Cyclops from X-Men is a cop. And so I mentioned this to Jessica and said, hey, should we talk about this? And Jessica went, what do you mean Cyclops is a cop? Why would anyone ever say that? And I said, well, no, but I hear people say that all the time. And I did some Google searching and I found article after article of here's why all the people saying that Cyclops is a cop are wrong. What I couldn't find is a single person saying Cyclops is a cop. I found a couple of well, here are the good reasons for that argument, but also I think it's wrong. And Google AI told me that there is some stuff out there, but could not find any of it. But it did stumble me into what are Green Lanterns a cop? And is the Green Lantern literally space cops? And what does that mean? And Jessica again had an eyebrow that went pretty far up, but still, I mean, I only got an email, but I could sense the eyebrow and how high it went. But it kind of led to this larger discussion about why do people label folks like Cyclops and Green Lantern cops, and what does it mean? And is there I think there's some level in which people can say that most superheroes are cops, and is that true to some extent, or is it not? And how do we, as people who, making an assumption about a large amount of my audience that I think is fairly true, is somewhere on the ACAB spectrum and not generally a huge fan of cops, but also a pretty big fans of people who use violence to stop people from doing bad things. How do we reconcile all this? So, Jessica, I'm so glad you're here. Let's start with the easy part. Is Cyclops a cop?
No. All right, episode over. Thanks
episode over. We're done.
and
I did do some digging, and I think part of the reason, and I'll admit, when people have described him as I've heard people mention it, I just haven't seen it written down. I can't find articles about it. But I do think that the reason is that at least in the Michael Bendis movies, and especially in the X-Men 97 show, that he's presented often as the cop in opposition to, he's the good guy in opposition to Wolverine as the rebel. He's the rule follower.
he's the square.
He's the square. He's the Boy Scout. He's the one who wants to make sure that you're in bed by curfew, while Wolverine wants to help you sneak out and go smoke cigarettes behind the garage or whatever. So
I mean, yeah. I think we have to. There are two separate questions at play here. Mm-hmm. One is Cyclops a cop? And the other is Cyclops boring? And they're not related. And I will say, just to establish where I'm coming from, I am still learning X-Men stuff. I embarked on a project a couple of years ago to read every X-Men comic from the beginning because I am incapable of moderation. And I'm only up to 1994. But that's 30 years under my belt. And I've read some more recent stuff, the Krakoa era, for listeners who are familiar with that. But I have a big gap of about 30 years in there. So there's gaps in my knowledge. I will also admit to being a Cyclops apologist. I really like him. I think he's a great character who is not served well by any adaptations I've seen. Adaptations really love to do that thing where they put him in opposition to Wolverine, where Wolverine's really cool and Cyclops is like a boring square loser. And why doesn't Jean Grey just dump him? And it's well, because she's been in love with him since she was 16 and this extremely old man who smells like wet dog doesn't know how to take no for an answer. Like, this
I was
isn't
gonna
a
say
hard question.
it does seem that a lot of the anti-Scott stuff comes from the way that love triangle is often framed, and that especially when
Absolutely.
Wolverine is your point of view character and Cyclops is the guy getting in the way.
Right. But like when we look at which of those characters has worked as a Fed, it's
Mm-hmm.
not Scott Summers.
Yeah.
Right. And like, I mean, when you raised the question with me, I said I was there, as you said, I was bewildered because Cyclops is the leader of a paramilitary organization of marginalized activists who
Mm-hmm.
are most of the time just trying to defend themselves, their community, and people, you know, the most marginalized and the most oppressed of them from often the state.
Right.
So it was bewildering to me. And then you were like, oh, because he's boring. And I was like, oh, I get it, but still no.
Yeah.
Which also, to be clear, he is boring. Like, this is a man who thinks that putting mayonnaise on a sandwich is getting a little bit too crazy. Like, this is
So
all true.
so basically, two Jews from New York City wrote a Midwesterner, is what I'm hearing in terms of the creation. And I say that
I
as a Jew from New
mean,
York City who moved to the Midwest to give you my perspective, where I try to cook
yeah,
for people and they think mayo is a spice. So just
he did grow up in Kansas
okay.
in
Okay.
like a torture orphanage. He had a real bad childhood.
That's fair. That's fair. Well, and I think this is a good sort of like we're laughing and joking about this, but it actually, I think, is a good way to start discussing the larger question of what do we mean when we say someone is a cop and how does that play into feelings of ACAB, the kind of general sense
Mhm.
of like being against cops. And I do think that there's an extent to which when we say someone's a cop, there are two different things we can mean. One is that they are actually part of the government run clerical system of state legal monopoly on violence that uses that violence to enforce state aims that are in theory law and justice and goodness for all, but often tends to be the defense of property and of capital and of white people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, within within subcultures, within communities that are fighting against the Uber culture, within things like that, you do sometimes have struggles over should we have rules or should we not? And should we be anarchists or should we be organized? And what does all that mean? And that's certainly been a part of the X-Men. And I think in a lot of times, X-Men is just one of those, but you have a sort of sense of like, look, we're fighting against the law, we're fighting against the rebels, but we still have a leader named Professor X, we still have Princess Leia, we still have like whatever the authority is, we still have Superman running the Justice League, and yet someone is going to be like, well, I'm going to be the rebel even within that.
Yeah.
And then someone else who's like, no, Professor X made this rule, Logan, you've got to follow the rule. And I think it's fair to say that that's a role that Cyclops often plays.
It can be, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And also, like, the thing is, respectability politics is a big
Mm-hmm.
conversation in X-Men narratives. And I think it intersects a lot with
Just
convert.
can you say
Yeah,
more about what you mean exactly by respectability politics?
yeah, definitely. But I'll unpack it all together. But it intersects a lot with passing privilege
Mm-hmm.
and with various characters' experiences of their own mutation and their own experience. So, what I mean by all of that is like, not all mutants are created equally, right? And you have
Mm-hmm.
some who look totally normal and can turn off their powers. Like Jean Grey, you would never know that she's a mutant if she didn't tell
Yeah.
you. If you find out, she can erase that memory from your brain. She looks like a human, like she passes completely. It is her choice to be public about her mutation. Somebody like Cyclops passes pretty well as long as he has his special sunglasses on. You wouldn't know.
Right.
So he has that, and he has that like I mean, a big part of why he's so repressed and like tight-laced is because if his sunglasses fall off, he kills people. Like,
Right.
it's a reasonable concern. And then you have characters who can like turn their powers on and off, like Iceman. Like, he can look totally normal or he can
Right.
turn the powers on. But then you have people who are blue and furry,
Yeah.
or who can't ever touch anybody, because in the comics, Rogue doesn't kill people. If she touches them, she just absorbs their powers and memories, but whatever. Or and those are like the photogenic ones, like characters like Nightcrawler and Beast, who are blue and furry. Those are like the sexy blue furry ones. There's
Right.
like a whole community of mutants called the Morlocks, who live in the sewers, who are like, yeah, I look like a giant slug and my power is that I kill people with my breath. Like,
Right.
so when a character who has an invisible or easily hidden mutation, and is also in most cases canonically straight, white, thin, able-bodied, pretty, says to the kid who's green with bones growing out of his face, no, that's not the way that you should be a mutant. That's not how we should behave.
Right.
It doesn't always land well. And I don't think that's super relevant. I mean, it's somewhat relevant with Wolverine because he's like 200 years old and he's been through. Scott Summers has tried really hard to have as much trauma in 30 years in his life as Wolverine has had in 200.
Speed
But
run.
he's trying so hard, but it's very difficult. But
Yeah.
like, a lot of that, being a mutant is very, very different for all of these characters. And so, I mean, even Professor X and Magneto is a great example, because Charles Xavier grew up wealthy and privileged and with a hidden mutation. And obviously Magneto's is hidden, but he did not have a privileged childhood, as we know.
Yeah, he grows up in the Holocaust, and when he uses his power, it's very, very apparent. And
Right.
and when Professor X does, generally you can't tell, like you're saying with
Mhm.
Jean Grey. And that's
Sort of the whole
I think that's
point.
also where the respectability politics comes in. And for anyone who doesn't know that term, it's one that comes up a lot in terms of like when within a lot of different minority groups, I think the term originally was coined within Black communities, but also has been used
I
within
think
queer
so.
communities, with a lot of where, like you might have one group that's like, oh, we need to stop saying the N-word. We need to like not, our language, we need to look respectable so that white society will take us seriously. Or like within gay community of like, we need to be like, 2.3 kids and a white picket fence and stop having all the crazy leather and stuff and just look like straight America. Just that's often respectability politics. And
Right.
I think there's a way in which you can see a lot of that between Professor X and Magneto, especially in more recent years, as people are trying to make, as Magneto is being seen as having a more sympathetic argument, even if the methods he uses to advance his argument aren't what we agree with, but that there's some problems of Professor X is kind of like, let's just not scare people, which can be a way of, people who look like slugs and kill with their breath. It's not their fault, but that would scare people. So
Absolutely.
so maybe is it more appropriate than to say that Scott isn't a cop, he's a narc? Because he does like if he sees someone break the rules, I feel like he's more likely to tell Professor X than Wolverine might be, or some of the other ones.
I don't think he needs to tell Professor X. Like, he's not going running to daddy. He's in charge. Like, he doesn't have to. There's no one to narc to. He. How do I wouldn't say he's a. I mean, also the thing is, this character has grown and changed a lot over the course of 60 years, right?
That's fair.
So how he started out is not how he is now necessarily, and he has moved. I don't know if it's. I'll put it this way: he's become much more radical. I
Right.
would say he is more radical than Professor X these days. In my understanding, again, I have my gaps in my reading, but I would say that he's certainly more ethical, significantly, but he is also much more like he will do extreme things if he believes that they're necessary. Being, that buttoned up good boy is not so much part of his landscape anymore, although it has been. I mean, like I said, I'm reading comics from the early 90s now, which the writing of those is very much in keeping with the animated X-Men show that was on at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they're so funny because he's constantly being like, Jubilee, she's like the teenage member of the team, turn that racket down. Like, he's so square, and it's hilarious.
Right.
Um, but at the same time, like, I think it's perfectly legitimate to be like, that guy's annoying and I don't enjoy him. Like, I want to
Right.
protect him. I'm just this terribly abused man. But like, it's totally valid to be like, this guy's a pain in the ass and he's always telling Jubilee to turn down her MTV and whatever. Okay,
Right.
not to rollerblade inside the house, which he's probably right. But I don't think there's a difference between finding a character personally annoying or someone you don't want to hang with and being
Right.
like, they're doing something morally wrong.
Yeah. No, and I get that. And I think that that's like the boring, the square part, the aw shucks dad part. I think that's definitely a part of it. And I think also the idea that if there is this idea that the X-Men do have rules, which in general I'm not the biggest fan of, but maybe when you adopt a whole bunch of troubled teenagers, I am a father now, and the idea of maybe not having completely ruleless things for kids is a little bit stronger in my head.
Has
But
the rollerblading inside the house already started?
he's 10 months old, but he has started doing an inchworm thing where I can't just set him down like 2 feet away from something very dangerous and know that he won't go near that, because he can
So
now.
like a month or so.
Yeah, exactly. The rollerblade. You made him a very nice hat. Aunt Jessica is not allowed to get him rollerblades. That is
All
verboten.
right.
But I think it gets this larger issue that we'll talk about more as we go on, but I think we need better language to describe, like, I'm not going to defend cops by any means. I'm trying to be very clear that that's not what I'm doing. But that I think sometimes we have language that is, oh, this person is the cop of the X-Men, the cop of the Justice League. And we can say maybe that's a bad thing or maybe that's a good thing. But the whole point of ACAB, at least as I understand it, is that you are connected to this larger government clerical system that clearly Scott is not. And that there's some level of one person using force to enforce rules on someone else is inherently problematic. But even if you want to say Scott is the rules enforcer of the X-Men, to me that is still very different than he is a cop with all of the ACAB associations that has with it.
Absolutely. And I also think like rules enforcing is not necessary. Like, the problem with cops is not that they follow the rules, because if cops rigidly followed the rules, then we'd have fewer black men being killed in the streets with
Right.
unnecessary use of deadly force. Like, that's the to me, I think your definition of ACAB is very accurate, but I would also add to that, it's the blue wall of silence. It's
Yeah.
the protecting cops who have um, broken the rules in whatever way, whether that is that unnecessary use of force or corruption, other kinds of corruption. I mean,
Right.
what's the thing about how cops can just like seize property and
Mm-hmm.
it's just theirs? Like,
And I'm now having trouble remembering the name, but the guy who is playing Jon Stewart in the upcoming Green Lantern show was in a movie about exactly that concept. That I'm gonna cut this out later if you're about to look it up.
yeah. Oh my God, why is this not coming up? Aaron Pierre.
Aaron Pierre. Do you have the name of the movie?
No, it was about. What did you say it was about?
It's about this idea of seizure. Rebel Ridge, the name of the movie, and all right, I'll take this whole part again. Yeah, no, that's such a good point, and Aaron Pierre, the guy who's going to be playing Jon Stewart in the upcoming Green Lantern show, he actually starred in this fantastic movie called Rebel Ridge that's all about this ability of cops just to seize property if there's any just suspicion that it's connected to drugs. And yeah, and it's, I think we can talk about how there are some superheroes who are very much not cops, but they are basically, they're not cops because the cops aren't being good at being cops, and so they're trying to be better at being cops, and it's because of corruption. But like, I still don't think Batman is a cab, but he's probably a lot closer than Scott Summers, and
Well,
someone like the Punisher, who's like, well, the Punisher is not a cop by any means, but he's also like, yeah, I don't want to be a cop. The cops have to let the criminals live. Fuck that. Like,
yeah, and
Frank
I think
Castle
that
is certainly use force to enforce law.
absolutely. And I think part of that too is looking at how a particular character or franchise is designed and like what's their day to day.
Right.
So with a character like Batman or Superman or Spider-Man or like a ton of superheroes, it's sort of the MO that we expect. They patrol, they see people doing crimes, and then they stop them, and they don't typically have a means of incarcerating them, so they leave them for the cops to do that. But they are, like you said, doing the job of the cops, whether it's because the cops are not doing it, because it's, one of the Batman stories where the police force is really corrupt, but often they're not. I mean, Commissioner
Right.
Gordon is not supposed to be corrupt. And the Spider-Man comics do not typically portray the NYPD as being rampantly corrupt, whether they should or not. Like they
Right.
don't. Daredevil comics sometimes do, but or at least Bad Apples. But Spider-Man still basically doing a police route, whereas characters like the X-Men, that's just not what they do. They're not, if they see a bank being robbed, they'll stop it because they, can
Right.
teleport and turn into metal and stuff. So what else do they have to do today? But like that's not their goal. Their goal is
Right.
like, uh-oh, someone's trying to genocide us again. So like that's not, they're not generally tying people up and leaving them for the cops. That's not really the structure of their stories.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so with Aaron Pierre in our mind, let's now shift to Green Lantern, because I will admit, I do not know much about Green Lantern. I know Jon Stewart primarily from the Justice League cartoon, which I thought was just utterly fantastic. I know the really, really bad movie that was made with oh my god, I can't remember his name now.
Ryan Reynolds,
With Ryan Reynolds, that his Deadpool went back and
Deadpool.
stopped him from doing so. Um and that's about it. And I will say, from the little that I know, and also some Wikipedia searches, and we did do some, you and I have had some conversations before about the Green Lantern Corps and stuff like that. They feel like international, like they are intergalactic Interpol, as far as I can tell. Am I?
Yes and no, and that's the thing. Like when you first raised that, I was like, it's complicated, and it depends on the era. And I am a big Green Lantern fan. I'm
Mm-hmm.
very well versed in those guys. Initially, I'm saying initially with the caveat, like the first Green Lantern, Alan Scott doesn't have anything to do with the outer space ones, like the one
Yeah.
from the World War II era, totally different. We're not talking about him, but the ones who are part of the Green Lantern Corps. So from 1959 on, I mean, it's sort of inherent in the idea that they are part of the Green Lantern Corps. That's CORPS, like the Marine Corps or the Peace Corps.
Mm-hmm.
That they are part of, that they represent authority, right? They are a part of an organization that is explicitly like the guardians, the aliens who give them their rings and imbue them with their power, literally created the Green Lantern Corps to spread order throughout the universe. So
Right.
that is absolutely an element of it. And especially given that this whole concept arose in the Green Lantern Corps as a whole, didn't really germinate in 59, but like in the early 60s, that was a very comics code heavy not quite McCarthy, but like a pretty the early 60s, still very conservative time in comics. So yeah, Hal Jordan was stopping bank robbers and handing them
Hmm.
over to the cops. He was, working with the cops. Like everything was very that sort of unthinking assumption that the police are always good and always right. And
Right.
but all that said, he was more like he's a standard superhero, right? He was not
Right.
doing a ton of stuff with the Green Lantern Corps. He was on Earth, like doing Earth superhero stuff. And then he'd go to another planet and he'd meet, Kat Matui or uh completely blanking. You don't care at all, but it's driving me nuts that I can't remember the name. Tomar Ray.
Oh, of course.
Meet
I have no idea
Of
who Tom
course,
Murray is, but
obviously. The Green
well,
Lantern of Krypton, who let Krypton be destroyed. But like
oh, fuck him.
those guys are just the superhero of wherever they are. It's not
Right.
like it's
Well,
a very standard superhero expression.
I guess
And it's
my impression had been, and maybe this is from just the little I remember from the comics, or just also again how it's from the cartoon, or how it's just been told again and again and like passed down to me. I mean, not over generations. You know what I mean? Like someone reads a comic and tells someone and tells someone and tells me. But my sense had been not as much even that he was like working with cops on Earth, but that he was kind of like the old days where maybe even like the cops of today, but more like he's the sheriff, like, and that the Green Lantern Corps gives each town a sheriff, and they're all supposed to have rules they follow, and that sometimes someone tries to do basically intergalactic crime and like rob Earth of its resources or kill a bunch of its people or steal a princess, and he stops them, and that there is some sort of like Green Lantern court system that they would then bring them back to and say, okay, I have the green handcuffs that are on him from my ring. I'm dropping him off for trial or for face the great people high up on the pillars and platforms from the dumb movie or whatever it was. Is there some accuracy to that idea of space cop?
Yeah, I think Green Lanterns as sheriffs is a really good way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was gonna say is like that's sort of the earlier, like they're just kind of a lone superhero guarding their sector kind of thing. It's in more recent decades that the idea of Green Lanterns as space cops and or space military has really ramped
Mm,
up. And to be honest, I would say that it didn't stem from the cartoon, but I think the cartoon was a really big influence. The Justice League cartoon, not the Green Lantern cartoon, which I'm not really familiar with. But you do like in the 80s, you start to get more stories featuring the core where they're like interacting. Um, but then like most of them lose their power. Whatever. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of it. The cartoon did something I think is really noteworthy, which is that it made John Stewart a former Marine,
mm,
which had not been his backstory in the comics. In the comics, he was an architect, which
that's a
could
big
not be
shift.
more different.
Yeah.
And in fact, his very first appearance, the first time we ever see him in a comic in 1971, he's actually getting into a fight with a cop because the cop is hassling a couple of old black men for playing dominoes on the sidewalk. And
Mm,
John, who's young and angry, steps in and is like, "Is there a problem, officer?" And
right.
Hal, who's watching this with a guardian, is like, "Oh, I don't want to teach him how to be a Green Lantern. He's got a chip on his shoulder." And over the decades, John's personality, like you see this honestly with a lot of black male characters who were introduced in the 70s and early 80s. They're introduced as very angry and very um, uh, sensitive to racial issues,
Right.
understandably, and now they're the sensible one. And John is the sensible one of our main Green Lanterns.
Yeah.
But the cartoon made him a Marine, and a few years after that, um, Hal Jordan, Hal Jordan had been dead. The Green Lantern Corps was gone. Jeff Johns, who was the writer and producer of that terrible movie, brought him back, brought the Green Lantern Corps back, and he loves cops and the military. He loves them, and that became a much bigger part of the narrative. So all of a sudden, for example, instead of the Green Lanterns being solo on patrol, they were partnered, which immediately turns everything into a buddy cop story.
Yep.
Hal did not have a military background before this. He was a test pilot, but for a private company. Now he's former Air Force. In 2011, Guy Gardner, all of a sudden, retconned to be a former cop. Guy had not been a cop. He'd been a special ed gym teacher. Like,
that's a big difference.
Really aggressively took away any softness or artisticness from these men, with the exception of...
Hello?
You are tough military policemen. And there's a certain appeal
to it. Hold on. You got cut off with the exception of... So do you mind just starting from there again?
Oh. Yeah, with the exception of Kyle Rayner, who is an artist. That's what he does. That's always going to be what he does. But they really amped up this you are hard military policemen, and they really steered... Some of it was good. They really steered into this, like, comradely brother in arms thing, which is very compelling. A lot of it works really well. But it's a massive tonal shift from the Green Lantern comics we were seeing in the 60s and 70s. And so when I'm hesitant to sign off on, like, oh yeah, they're cops, it's not because I did, like, that is how they're presented now.
Right.
But I'm unwilling to cede that ground because it doesn't have to be how they're presented. Right. And there's precedent for it not being.
And I think there's a number of different things at work here. And one of them is that when I think about John Stewart as that, describing a black man as a former Marine in the early 70s, I think is a very intentional and very interesting choice that you can read in two very different ways. One of which...
He wasn't, though. He was introduced in the early 70s as just a guy.
Oh,
he didn't have a job.
Just
it was the cartoon
the
cartoon in 2003 that made him...
Okay. Well, it's interesting in a different way, but then to me, that's a kind of version of what I was going to say about the 70s, but very different in 2003. But still, it's that idea of we're going to stop making him street. We're going to stop, like, we're going to show you that he has the authority, that he has the capacities for violence and stuff. He is not that stereotype of the angry young black man from the street. He is military. He's all American. He's all that kind of stuff. And again, that can be done in a very good or a very bad way. And I haven't seen the show anywhere nearly recently enough to comment on that. But also I think that one of the reasons why I think people use ACAB a lot, and I don't want to get into a whole debate about that, but I think it's impossible for us not to discuss it to some extent, is the idea that, in the United States, our police system was based on slave catcher patrols. Like, that was the original police. And so racism and the using of violence to stop black people from getting out of their place has been baked into American policing and to policing throughout the Western world, certainly the white world, and in some regards throughout all the United States, all through the world from its very inception. And that's part of why there's often the sense of telling a story about cops, about good cops, winds up being a kind of propaganda and winds up becoming like we're not wrestling with the fact that policing in this country and in this world is fundamentally flawed. And I do think there's something interesting in saying, can you have people who are empowered by a government to help enforce the rules without all that being baked into it? And can you do that in a intergalactic setting? The problem is that there's a level of intentionality behind that that's almost never done, and probably it shouldn't be white people telling that story to begin with. And there's just like eight different levels of things that pop into that. And so it just feels like one of these times where there's a very important shorthand that we're using that is a part of this conversation that needs to be, but also at times like Green Lantern doesn't exactly. It feels like you can put that over Green Lantern and it somewhat describes it, but there's also a lot of other things going on as well.
Yeah, and I think your question of like, is it possible to tell this story of people using force to preserve some kind of order that is established by some kind of authority?
Mm-hmm.
It, I think that, I mean, that's a huge question, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that I don't know if it undercuts it or supports it, but and this is relevant with both the X-Men and Green Lanterns and many manifestations of this is like I on the one hand, like you have the stories where that's done
Mm-hmm.
unquestioningly, where it's like,
Right.
well, okay, so authority said this, so it must be right. But I think what you more often have are these stories where, at least in these narrative examples, these stories where it turns out that the authority is wrong or corrupt in some way. Like
Right.
I could not tell you how many stories, Green Lantern stories, there are where it turns out the Guardians are just they're horrible. They're the worst.
Yeah.
They're just awful. And every time the Green Lanterns are like, "What?" They're always so surprised. Like, you lied to us again about a terrible ancient evil from outer space. How could this be? And I mentioned earlier, like I think Scott Summers is a much more ethical person than Charles Xavier. This, whose authority are we
I,
enforcing? And
I
is
got to be honest, that's a low bar.
you're not wrong, but like is it, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Like, is it possible to have authority that is not corrupt? But if you don't have that, if you don't have those structures and you're just relying on the integrity of whoever your agent is, then not to bring every single episode of your show back to the Civil War movie, but you end up with Steve Rogers going, I can do whatever I want in any country I want because I'm sad about my friend and I'm nice,
Right.
which is not how that should work.
Yeah. Because, and that's what I've always said, is that the reason why well, at least I think there's an argument for Team Tony is because when I hear Steve Rogers say, if you are sure you're right, you say you move. That's what the US is. The United
Yeah.
States is, we're sad about the Nazis and we're sad about the communists and we're nice. So we're going to go be nice to the whole world and be police so they don't get the communists. And guess what? That means killing a lot of their elected leaders and overthrowing their governments and Vietnam and stuff like that.
Yeah, and like not that I think Tony Stark should be in charge of everything, but at least within the confines of the MCU, um, Tony Stark is capable of understanding that sometimes he makes a mistake, and Steve
Right.
Rogers does not seem to be. Bless his heart. Like, I mean,
I mean,
Tony will still make more mistakes, but at least he knows he's
yeah.
capable of it.
You mentioned the blue wall of silence and things like that. And I think one of the things that makes ACAB what it is the fact that the police are as a general rule very good at not being accountable to anyone but themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and preventing all efforts to make them accountable to civilian review boards or to lawsuits or to criminal prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
And I live here in Minnesota, where we do have cops who are in jail because of the killing of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd. But even there, the cops were able to be like, no, those were the bad app. We as a department are not on trial. It was them as, and not, you brought it back to Civil War, so I'm going to have a few Pringles out of that can you've popped. But because once we pop Civil War, we can't stop.
It's okay. I want to talk about Batman after this, so we're
Yeah,
staying
perfect.
really on
It's
trend.
fine. Well, and to me, the reason I think there's an extent to which they're both right, in that Tony's initial argument is we have to be accountable to someone else besides ourselves, because maybe Scarlet Witch did nothing wrong or did the best possible thing, even though those people, innocent civilians, died. But we can't be the ones to decide that. Someone else has to look over it. Tony is right that they need accountability. Steve is right that the Sokovia Accords are a really dumb way to give them accountability, and there should be a better one. And yeah, and that's where the conflict is. And so I think that's where, if there's ever going to be any, this, to me, the superheroes that I care about are always the ones where, like, the Arrowverse gets highly maligned these days, but I think is in many ways before it went pretty far off the tracks, some of the best superhero television that we've seen. And some of the best interconnected, like, what does a world of superheroes look like? And one thing I think they really did well is they each were part of these chosen families that held them accountable. So that when what the hell is Quinn? Steve? No, it's Stephen Amell plays him. What's what the Arrow? What's his actual first name? What's his
Ollie?
name? Oliver, not Oliver North. Oliver Quinn. Yeah.
Queen.
Queen, not Quinn. When Oliver starts to go off the rails, his friends pull him back somewhat. When Diggle starts to go off the rails, his friends pull him back somewhat. And same with Tara, and same with the Supergirl, and same with whatever that crazy military thing that they work for is. All these things. There's at least some. It's not Cadmus. Cadmus is all the bad guys, but it's.
Was it the DEO or was it
I
Star
think
Labs? It wasn't Star Labs.
No, Star Labs is the Flash. It was some version of the Department of Defense. Yeah, DoD. But yeah, anyway, again, all of those I think fall into cop patterns sometimes in really problematic ways. I'm not saying, oh, as long as you've got some buddies to tell you no, then it's fine to go be a cop. But at least I appreciate those stories are wrestling with it somewhat.
Yeah, and it's such a big question, and it's something that is complicated by the fact that these are massive sprawling universes, and what applies to one type of character doesn't apply to another type of character. So obviously Marvel Comics did Civil War before the MCU did, and the central question, that the thing that caused the violence to break out, was very different. But it was the same sort of idea of superheroes can cause collateral damage and people can die, so they need to register. But that's very different in a world where you have mutants,
Right?
Because this is a persecuted minority, and a lot of them are not fighting crime. They're just going to 7th grade math class, and now the government has a registry of them. Great, that's not going to go anywhere bad. So what can work for one character does not necessarily apply to another character. And yeah, I don't know, like, if there were to be an outside system that holds superheroes accountable, I can't think what that would or should be that feels reliable. But I mean, in terms of characters who do whatever they want and are accountable to no one, I said I was going to bring up Batman, and I feel like
let's talk about Batman.
I mean, he's a perfect example. And like, arguably you could say Superman too. And certainly Superman has engaged in some very copish behaviors, but he's a much more sensible person. I mean, I guess it depends on the media. Like, let's there's always Man of Steel.
I mean, I'm always going to defend my friend Mr. Bruce Wayne, as deeply emotionally troubled as he is, but that's kind of my point. They both lose their parents. One loses their parents before they're old enough to remember, let alone conceive of the idea of parents. The other has their parents shot in front of them because they wanted to leave a play because they were scared of bats. Yeah, that's the Christopher Nolan interpretation. There's other versions, but okay. Still, it's still, Bruce Wayne has them shot in front of him, often in ways that are his fault, quote unquote.
I know this isn't what you meant, but the way you said it, Bruce Wayne has them shot in front of him, like he hired
no.
Joe Chill. No. He's like, they took me to this horrible play and I'm taking them out.
No. And then Superman is raised by the most all-American, sweet, wonderful, loving couple in the world. Bruce Wayne is raised by a psychotic British butler who thinks training him how to kill is healthy. And maybe tries to stop him sometimes. And he is somewhat the person who holds him accountable, but also you can't hold accountable the person who pays your salary. which
It's almost like when you have an 8-year-old who's either discovering that they can crush rocks into diamonds or is very angry about their dead parents. It's better to say, hey, you have to be chill about this and
Mhm.
be nice to people and not just be dryly Britishly sarcastic about it.
Yes. Did you ever see the TV show Alfred?
Somehow that one didn't draw me in. Wasn't it Pennyworth? Or did
Pennyworth.
they?
It was called Pennyworth.
I
Where yeah,
didn't. It was a whole thing where they changed the title.
it was about him being young in Britain at this time where they're like where the government is like hanging people and then like
What?
disemboweling them while they're being hung in this like horribly brutal way
Oh,
that the camera
so
lingered
the
on.
Tudor era?
Exactly. So, but I think you do raise a really good point in that it's funny that Batman is often seen as like very anti-cop, and I think he is. And I think the idea of like Batman would look at the cops of today and be like, yeah, Derek Chauvin like is horrible. The Minneapolis, the New York Police Department under Giuliani, under any prime, like LAPD, all these things, they are awful and terrible and have to go. But he'd also be like, because they're not doing a good enough job arresting drug dealers and putting them in prison,
Right.
and the fact that like, granted, there's all these different versions, but as you said, Commissioner Gordon is either like in Batman 66, like the police are fine, they're just kind of bumbling, or, I mean, and this is pure propaganda in things like the Christopher Nolan movies or some of the other versions, Gordon is the one person who wants to be a good cop. Because, of course, there are good cops. We just have to, it's just that instead of there being like a barrel of good apples and one bad one, he's the one good apple in the bad apple barrel. And now that metaphor has been completely driven into the ground. And so he needs Batman to help him become the cop again. But
Right.
yeah, I mean, but they're all based on the idea of it is possible in the American clerical system to have good cops and that Batman would support them, just not the bad cops.
Well, and so often the words that are written on the page about Batman and what he does, or the dialogue that is spoken, is in direct opposition with what looks cool to draw or film, and
Right.
what we have been sort of trained by our media to think is really cool and badass. So, what we want to see is this billionaire driving his tank around, getting 4 inches to the gallon and knocking over, like flattening other cars and knocking over dog walkers and whatever, and then beating the crap out of clowns and dangling them from lampposts, and shooting bazookas at Bane in the middle of the supermarket, or whatever the hell it is he's doing, and breaking into wherever, like absolutely no regard for anybody's privacy, surveilling the entire
Mm-hmm.
city, if not the entire planet, including his friends, and then taking these loathsome scum and dropping them into this torture asylum that's full of black mold and people whispering, "You should kill again," into your ears all night. And then the dialogue will be like, but once they get out, the Wayne Foundation will support them. And it's like, come on, man. Like, and the people will say that as a gotcha. And like, it's true. Like,
Right.
I think in every canon, we're told over and over again that Bruce Wayne is putting all of this money and all this effort and all this time and the weight of his name behind these much more compassionate and much more effective ways of improving the city. But we don't see them because they're not interesting to draw and they don't work.
Right.
So there's this constant tension between, no, but he's not doing any of that, and just showing him as a super cop dressed like a
Right.
bat.
Well, and I think there's two parts to that. One is that, and this is something we've talked about in other episodes, it's the same reason why having Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. sitting down at a conference table and going, okay, well, clause 1 of the Sokovia Accords has some decent ideas, but I need to take out amendments 3 and 4. Like, I would love that. You
It's
would
your
love
dream
that.
movie.
And we might get 10 other people who would watch that. And that's about it. And the same way, I think that level of conversation and, Bruce Wayne running an orphanage might make a good like TV show that very few people would watch, but those people who do would love, but it's not going to be a $500 million movie anymore. I mean, it never was, but especially in this Hollywood. But the flip side about that is, and here's where I'm going to use the defense that you've used for some of these people, Batman has changed a lot. And I think in the same way that we have to be careful not to say, well, this was Scott Summers and the Green Lantern's attitudes towards the police in the 60s, and so therefore we can apply that to today. I do think that the Batman movies and stories have evolved to be a lot more about, hey, wait a minute, maybe we actually should be doing this charitable stuff, not just as well as punching criminals, but maybe because if you actually treat, homeless 10-year-olds better, they don't become people who grow up to be working for the Joker or the Riddler because that's their literally only option because all of society has shut its doors on them. And did you ever see the Bat movie, the most recent, The Batman?
I haven't. I keep meaning to.
Well, I not a spoiler, but I do think it is very significant that
you're free to spoil. Yeah, this is on me at this point.
This is a big spoiler. The final third of the movie is about him stop fighting the bad guys and him rescuing their victims, and literally lighting a torch that leads them out of the darkness into the light. And it's, I think, a very powerful symbol of, because other people have sort of challenged Bruce Wayne of why aren't you doing more to help? Why aren't you doing more to help and to protect? And so it's just my way of saying, I do think that the Bruce Wayne story is slowly and from behind catching up to those things. I think Frank Castle still has a way. Bruce Wayne has a ways to go. Frank Castle has even further to go, much as I love the guy.
And I will say, I mean, that sounds awesome. And I hope it's true that the cinematic narrative is changing. That man is in 10 comics a month and he's still driving that tank over dog walkers.
Yeah, 5 different people are drawing him and writing him, and they're not lining up, and it's all over the place. No argument there.
Yeah.
Who are other heroes, just to kind of help wrap us up, who you think have an interesting perspective on, because they either are pretty close to cops or they're pretty far away from cops? Let me actually ask you about Oliver Queen, because I know Green Arrow, the comic character, is one of your favorites. What is his approach towards, he's shooting arrows, he's trying to stop bad people from doing bad things. How does he do that without falling into the cop system?
That is definitely, he was the first character I thought of when you said that, because he is sort of the go-to when you're thinking of a superhero who's explicitly progressive, liberal.
Right.
And he has definitely been, since the 70s, there have been comics that have shown him in opposition to the police and saying, this is a broken system. As you just alluded to, there's lots of comics written by lots of people, and that's not consistent, but he is always, at least for DC, he's always going to be the first character that they use, who's going to say ACAB. He's the only actual superhero I can think of who would say ACAB, with his mouth. That said,
he would be proud to be called woke, I think is a good description.
He would love it. He's got a little pin that says it. Actually, there's a Pride issue coming out this June, and he's wearing all these different pins. He's on a variant cover, and he's not queer himself canonically, but he's wearing all these pins, including one that says "I love my ace son," which is that checks out. He's the one who will call out this system is broken. That said, he's absolutely one of those characters whose MO is going on patrol and then catching bad guys and then I guess just tying them up and leaving them for the cops because he's not putting them in the Arrow jail. He doesn't have anywhere to put them. There's there's so much that's not thought through. I'm thinking of a story from the late 80s where he shoots a black teenage boy with an arrow because he thought the kid had a real gun and it was a fake gun, and he feels really bad about it afterwards. But then everybody's it was just a mistake, Ollie. The kid doesn't die, but he's everybody's stop beating yourself up about it. It was a mistake. And the moral of the story is he moves on. And it's like, no, you should probably not pick up that bow again.
And when was that story?
It was the late 80s, possibly the very early 90s.
Yeah, there were definitely
Might have
news
been the
stories
90s.
around then of cops shooting black teenagers with water guns, and
Mm-hmm.
like
That's exactly what it was.
if you
Yeah.
notice that like black toy guns always have that red tip, it's because that was
Mm-hmm.
happening a lot, and the
Yeah.
cops were always like, "Oh no, it's not really your fault," you know.
Yeah. So like that story was trying, but like it aged very poorly and it reads very badly today.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of other characters. I mean, one character who springs to mind, not a major character, but Squirrel Girl.
Okay,
She
not a party.
she's a
Go
Marvel
ahead.
character.
Uh-huh.
And she has all the powers of a squirrel. And she's amazing. She can her whole thing, like she's the unbeatable squirrel girl. She can beat anyone. She's beaten Galactus. Like she's
By holding him in the pockets of her cheeks.
she could if she needed to. She has super strength. But in like the 2010s, I think I want to say starting in 2014, there was a series by Ryan North and Erica Henderson called The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl. If you look it up, it's a little tricky because there was a comic. They launched the comic and they ran it for like 10 issues, and then Marvel canceled all of their comics and started everything at #1. So within that year, there were 2 comics called The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl #1 with the same creative team. But
God,
comics are very stupid. Don't read them. But these are great because they work really hard to have the character find other solutions to things besides violence. She can beat anybody up and win. And sometimes that's demonstrated, but more often than not, she will stop and talk to them and find out why they're doing this antisocial thing, whatever it may be, and find another solution. And it's a comedy. So like it is that sitting down and going over the Sokovia Accords line by line, but because it's a comedy, it's still entertaining to see it done.
mm-hmm.
But it's also, I would say, one of the most, if not the most, quietly revolutionary superhero comics I've ever read, because it's the only one that I've seen really put the work in to decouple the necessity of punitive violence from the concept of helping people.
That definitely makes it something that I want to pay attention to. I think, isn't there like a Squirrel Girl TV show or movie or something like that somewhere in the works?
There was gonna be, I think it's dead in the water.
Okay.
I think there's a podcast. There's like a full scripted podcast with like full cast. And I believe the actress who plays Squirrel Girl was the one they were going to have play her in the show that never happened. But yeah, for years they were trying to make it happen and it never materialized.
Got it. Well, if nothing else, I also highly recommend watching the movie Rebel Ridge because A, it'll get you really excited about Aaron Pierre because he's fantastic and very nice to look at, but also because
God, yeah.
Part of the point is that he was a de-escalation officer, like his job, and a lot of the movie is about how do you break cycles of violence, and that his job, like he is being falsely accused, and so his goal isn't to beat people up, it's to use de-escalation tactics to prevent them from beating him up and give him enough time to explain to them why they should be on his side. And you know, he's using physical force, but where he's like, you know, knocking guns out of people's hands and like preventing them from doing harm instead of doing harm to them himself. So
yeah,
definitely worth watching.
I think to that note, earlier I mentioned, like I compared Superman and Batman, and I said that Superman is also can be very policey, but he's less of a nut bar than Batman.
That's fair.
But I think also counterintuitively, it is the scope of his power that makes him less of a metaphor for a cop on a violent spree, because he when Batman engages in violence, he's using real world, for the most part, real world applications, just to a heightened extent. Superman is so much more powerful than the average, than an ordinary criminal. He can just pick him up by the scruff. Like the
Right.
level of, like, he can de-escalate a situation without harming people.
Right. He can
So,
heat up the gun so you drop it and things like that
right.
with perfect accuracy.
It's the way that, like, if you have a toddler throwing a tantrum, you can pick them up without harming them and be like, no, we're going to sit on the bed and not be doing this anymore, in a way that, like, you can't do that to an adult because you're on the same strength level as them, which I'm not saying like that all we need are cops with super strength, but it's just, it was something that struck me in the way that you phrased that, like, oh, okay, yeah, that's probably why, because like he doesn't have to get into the mud like that.
So true. Well, as always, Jessica, this has been a great conversation. For people who want to know more about your take on comics and stuff like that, where can they find you?
You can find me at my website and blog, jessicaplummerwrites.com. I write about superheroes a lot there. I also do a lot of writing about comics on bookriot.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. All those links will be in the show notes. As always, fans, let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your thoughts. We are also doing episode by episode, often 2 episode a week coverage on the Darth Maul show. On Maul Shadowlord, a story about someone who most definitely does not want to be a cop, but wants to be his own moral and physical and violent authority. So check that out. Check out all of our coverage. And of course, please tune in for more episodes. Tell your friends about these episodes. Help us spread the word. Let us know what you think. We want to hear it. On behalf of myself, Jessica, and thanks to all of you great people, may the force be with you. Because the Jedi certainly were not cops.